My husband smiled when the drug-sniffing dog lunged toward our luggage. It was just a subtle twitch at the corners of his mouth. The kind of micro-expression you only catch if you've spent 5 years studying one man's face. He thought I was going to spend the rest of my life in a foreign prison. He was absolutely certain he had plotted the perfect crime. He wanted to frame me for international drug trafficking, clear out his supposedly ideal life, and ride off into the sunset with his young secretary and millions of dollars stolen from his company's accounts. What he didn't know, however, was that I had already audited his perfect plan and quietly ghostwritten an entirely different ending for him. My name is Claire, and I am 33 years old. Today, I stood in the VIP security line at JFK International Airport in New York, holding a warm vanilla latte, waiting for the trap to finally snap shut. The morning air in Terminal 4 was thick with the smell of roasted coffee and nervous anticipation. The fluorescent lights above our heads hummed with a quiet, sterile sound that perfectly synchronized with the rapid beating of my heart. I took a slow, deliberate sip from my paper cup, letting the warmth of the beverage anchor me to reality. We were flying to the Maldives. It was supposed to be a luxury vacation to save our crumbling marriage. David, my 3-5-year-old husband and vice president of finance at a massive pharmaceutical conglomerate, had booked us first-class tickets. He said we needed time just for ourselves, to reconnect and remember why we fell in love in the first place. But David didn't want to reconnect with me. David wanted me to disappear. Right behind us in the same security line stood Chloe. She was 28. She smelled like a cloud of incredibly expensive perfume and held the official title of David's executive assistant. Unofficially, she was the woman he was sleeping with. David had insisted she take the same flight out of New York, claiming that during our layover in Dubai, she had to handle an urgent meeting with the board of directors before flying back to the States. It was an absolutely absurd excuse. The setup was so blatantly obvious and insulting that any self-respecting wife would have thrown a massive fit. But I had stopped acting like a normal wife 3 months ago. I had started acting like a forensic fraud examiner. I analyzed the numbers. I tracked hidden assets. I observed his behavior, refusing to let emotions cloud my judgment in the slightest. David was sweating. Despite the cold air conditioning of the terminal, a fine layer of moisture beaded on his forehead. He kept glancing at his platinum Rolex, shifting his weight in his custom-made Italian leather shoes. His eyes darted nervously between my elegant black suitcase on the conveyor belt and the stern faces of the TSA and customs officers ahead of us. "Go ahead, honey," David urged, placing a hand on the small of my back and pushing me slightly toward the metal detector. "Put the suitcase on the belt. Let's get this over with so we can relax in the VIP lounge." His touch sent shivers of disgust down my spine, but I flashed him a radiant, seemingly oblivious smile. "Of course, sweetie." I hoisted my heavy black suitcase and placed it squarely on the gray rubber conveyor belt of the X-ray scanner. Right next to my luggage sat Chloe's suitcase. It was a pristine Louis Vuitton rolling bag, practically screaming of money she certainly didn't make on an assistant's salary. Chloe stood there chewing mint gum, looking profoundly bored and irritated that she had to endure security procedures with the general public, even in the priority lane. As my suitcase rolled forward, the atmosphere at the checkpoint suddenly shifted. A Customs and Border Protection (CBP) K9 officer walked into our lane, leading a German Shepherd. The dog was alert, its nose twitching constantly as it moved along the line of passengers and their carry-on bags. David was practically vibrating with excitement. He tried to mask it with a look of mild irritation, but I could see the adrenaline pumping through his veins. I knew exactly what he was waiting for. The night before, while he thought I was dead asleep, I had watched him slice open the inner lining of my luggage. I watched him carefully wedge a vacuum-sealed plastic brick, wrapped tightly in black electrical tape, deep into the frame of my suitcase. He had packed enough synthetic narcotics in there to guarantee I'd be locked away in a foreign prison for the rest of my natural life. It was a brilliant, absolutely ruthless strategy. While I rotted in a cell overseas, he could easily file for divorce, seize all our joint assets, cash out my life insurance policies under the guise of legal fees, and simply vanish with Chloe. He would play the role of the devastated, betrayed husband whose wife turned out to be a ruthless criminal. But David made one fatal mistake. He forgot that I make my living finding the things other people desperately try to hide. I walked through the metal detector. The machine remained silent. No red lights, no beeping alarms. I stepped to the other side and turned around to calmly watch the show. The conveyor belt hummed loudly as my black suitcase emerged from the X-ray tunnel. The TSA officer staring at the monitor didn't even blink. He let my luggage roll down the metal rollers right toward me. I reached out, grabbed the handle, and pulled my suitcase off the belt. I looked up and met David's eyes. All the blood instantly drained from his face. His confident, expectant smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated confusion. He stared at my suitcase as if it had magically turned into a ghost. He looked at the X-ray monitor, then back at me, his mouth slightly ajar. He knew the package he planted was massive. There was absolutely no way it could have passed through an airport security scanner without lighting up the screens in red and triggering an immediate terminal-wide lockdown. David swallowed hard. His eyes frantically scoured the security area, looking for the trap he had so carefully set. And right at that moment, the German Shepherd snapped to attention. The dog bypassed me completely. It trotted right past David, ignoring his expensive leather briefcase. Instead, it lunged toward the conveyor belt, aggressively pressing its nose against the expensive canvas of Chloe's Louis Vuitton suitcase. The dog let out a sharp, authoritative bark and sat firmly right next to her bag. Chloe stopped chewing her gum. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together in deep annoyance. "Excuse me?" She snapped at the canine handler. "Get that dog away from my bag. It's shedding, and that's a designer piece." The officer didn't apologize. He immediately signaled the other guards. "We have a positive alert," he announced loudly. Suddenly, the monotonous hum of the airport security line popped like a soap bubble. 3 armed Port Authority and CBP officers materialized out of nowhere, completely surrounding the conveyor belt. A stern-faced supervisor stepped forward, pointing a gloved hand straight at Chloe. "Ma'am, please step away from the luggage and keep your hands where we can see them." Chloe sighed dramatically, clearly believing this was just some ridiculous misunderstanding. "You've got to be kidding me. Do you have any idea who I work for?" "David. Tell them this is a mistake." She turned to David for support, but David had ceased to function as a confident corporate executive. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. He was taking rapid, shallow breaths. He stared at Chloe's designer bag with wide, terrified eyes as his brain finally began snapping the puzzle pieces together. I stood about 10 feet away, casually leaning against a metal pillar. I took another slow sip of my vanilla latte. The coffee was perfectly sweet, contrasting beautifully with the bitter panic flooding the space between my husband and his mistress. "Ma'am," the supervisor said, his voice dropping an octave as he pulled Chloe's suitcase onto a heavy metal inspection table. "Are you traveling alone today? Did you pack this bag yourself?" "Yes, I packed it myself," Chloe said, her voice dripping with entitlement. "And I demand you be careful with it." The officer unzipped the main compartment. He didn't even bother looking at her folded silk dresses or expensive cosmetics. He ran his hands straight down the bottom frame of the suitcase. I watched his fingers trace the inner lining, pressing the fabric against the rigid structure. He found a slight irregularity in the material. With a swift motion, he pulled out a small tactical knife and sliced the lining open. David let out a choked, breathless gasp. He took a half step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. Fighting total paralysis, the officer reached deep into the hidden cavity of the luggage. When he pulled his hand out, he was holding a heavy, brick-sized package completely wrapped in black electrical tape. Chloe's face went entirely slack. The entitled irritation vanished from her features, replaced by pale, trembling terror. She stared at the black package as if it were a venomous snake. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know what that is." "That isn't mine." The officer didn't reply. He used his knife to make a small incision in the tape, exposing tightly packed, vacuum-sealed bags of white powder. He swabbed the substance with a small testing pad and placed it into a chemical analyzer. 5 seconds later, the liquid in the vial turned a bright, undeniable blue. Positive for Schedule I narcotics, the officer stated. Chloe started screaming. It was a high-pitched, hysterical sound that echoed off the high ceilings of Terminal 4. No! No! Someone planted that. David! David, help me! Tell them I don't know anything about this. David couldn't help her. David could barely breathe. He was staring at the brick of drugs he had personally bought and planted the night before. He tore his eyes away from Chloe and slowly shifted his gaze to me. I didn't look away. I didn't look scared or surprised. I just gave him one tiny, incredibly cold smile. At that exact moment, David finally understood everything. He realized that his naive, obedient wife had found his secret stash in the middle of the night. It dawned on him that while he was busy dreaming of his new life, I had sliced open Chloe's suitcase and transferred the lethal cargo. David opened his mouth to say something, but before he could utter a single word, a heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder. A deep, booming voice cut through Chloe's hysterical shrieking. Well, the voice said. Looks like we have a serious problem here. David spun around, coming face to face with a CBP task force squad that had just breached the checkpoint. At the head of the group stood a tall, powerfully built black officer in an immaculate uniform. The gold insignia gleamed on his shoulders. It was Jamal, my younger sister Rachel's husband. My brother-in-law, and the absolute last person David wanted to see standing between him and the airport exit. How did my husband, a respected VP of finance in the pharmaceutical industry, end up sweating under the merciless, sterile lights of JFK Airport while my brother-in-law prepared to read him his Miranda rights? To fully appreciate the poetry of this moment, we have to go back exactly 3 months. That was when the man I loved died, and the monster wearing his face finally took off his mask. It all started on a rainy Tuesday in October. Our marriage had been cold for a year, full of unspoken tension, with David constantly staying late at the office. I was sitting at our kitchen island in our Manhattan apartment, reviewing the statements from our joint bank account. As a forensic accountant, I understand numbers far better than I understand words. I noticed small anomalies, cash withdrawals that made no sense. Dinners at exclusive steakhouses on days David claimed he was eating stale sandwiches in the boardroom. When I confronted him with my findings that evening, the air in the room turned to ice. He didn't yell. He did something much worse. He walked over, placed his heavy hands on my shoulders, and looked at me with deep, fabricated pity. You're just imagining things, Claire, he whispered, his voice dripping with condescension. You've been so stressed with your own work lately. You're losing touch with reality. You're losing touch with reality. He repeated that sentence like a mantra for the next few weeks. If I asked about the strange smell of perfume on his jacket coat, I was losing touch with reality. If I questioned why he changed his phone passcode, I was losing touch with reality. The psychological torment was a slow, suffocating weight. I spent nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if my mind was genuinely unraveling. He isolated me from the rest of the world, making me feel completely dependent on his version of the truth. He wanted me weak, full of doubt, and blind. But he forgot one crucial detail about what I do for a living. I eat corporate fraud for breakfast. I don't stay blind for long. Instead of breaking down, I simply woke up. I stopped asking him questions and started asking the data. While David slept soundly next to me, deeply convinced he had successfully broken my spirit, I took my laptop into the guest room and went to work. I didn't cry. I audited. I bypassed the superficial joint accounts and dug into his corporate expense reports, cross-referencing that data with public registries and Delaware shell companies I suspected he was using. The numbers painted a vivid, undeniable picture of betrayal. I found receipts from a luxury boutique in Paris where he paid $20,000 for a diamond tennis bracelet. I found reservations for weekend getaways at 5-star resorts in Aspen. And weaving through this entire trail of financial breadcrumbs was one constant name, Chloe. His 8-year-old executive assistant. The same girl who always smiled a little too widely at the corporate holiday parties. The pain of his infidelity was like a sharp knife straight to the heart, but the financial irregularities I uncovered immediately afterward were like a bomb waiting to detonate. It dawned on me that David wasn't just cheating on me. He was funneling massive amounts of capital out of his pharmaceutical company. Those lavish gifts for Chloe were just a fraction of the missing funds. He was stealing millions. Armed with this knowledge, I did what any rational woman trained in financial warfare would do. I smiled, cooked his favorite meals, and kissed him on the cheek when he left for work. I became the perfect, oblivious wife, while in absolute silence, I built an ironclad dossier on him. And then came the trap. 2 weeks ago, David walked through the door of our apartment holding a glossy travel agency brochure. He wore a broad, boyish smile, the same one he used when we first started dating. He announced he had booked us first-class tickets to the Maldives. A romantic getaway, just the two of us. He claimed he wanted to save our marriage and reconnect with me. He held my hands and delivered a heart-wrenching speech about how much he loved me and how badly he wanted to fix everything. I almost bought the performance until he casually dropped the hook. He nonchalantly mentioned that Chloe would be flying on the exact same flight. According to David, she had an urgent meeting to handle with the board of directors in Dubai during our layover before returning to New York. It was the most absurd, transparent excuse I had ever heard. Bringing your mistress on the flight that was supposed to save your marriage wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. My internal alarms were blaring. I knew David. He was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid enough to risk an awkward confrontation at 30,000 feet just to have his girlfriend close by. He wanted her there for a specific reason. This wasn't a vacation, it was an ambush. He was planning something massive, something that required me to be off US soil, and he needed Chloe as his accomplice. Every time he kissed my forehead and told me how excited he was for our trip, that haunting phrase echoed in my mind, "You're losing touch with reality, Claire." I packed my bags with deliberate caution, playing the role of the eager, unsuspecting wife to perfection. I knew I was walking straight into a trap. But I also knew I held the ultimate leverage. He thought I was blind, but I saw every tiny string he was pulling. I was ready for whatever he planned to throw at me. I zipped up my suitcase, the sharp metallic sound slicing through the heavy silence of our bedroom. David didn't even look up from his phone. He stood casually by the window. His thumbs flew across the screen, a faint, arrogant smirk playing on his lips. He thought I was extinguished. He truly believed his months of sophisticated psychological torture had finally broken me and turned me into an obedient, hollow shell stripped of my own will. To understand how I became this cold, calculating version of myself, standing over a suitcase that was soon to become the centerpiece of his total destruction, you have to understand the pure hell he put me through. The realization of his affair and embezzlement didn't hit me overnight. It was preceded by a systematic, relentless campaign designed to destroy my sanity. It all reached a boiling point on a stifling Friday evening, 3 months earlier. I had just wrapped up a massive investigation at my firm, tearing apart the financial records of a corrupt logistics company. I came home exhausted, my eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets. I walked into the dining room, hoping for a quiet dinner with my husband. Instead, I found David sitting at the head of our oak table, slowly swirling a glass of scotch. His posture was rigid. The atmosphere in the room was as thick as the air right before a thunderstorm. That evening, I confronted him about a discrepancy I had found purely by accident. It was a simple alert from our joint credit card about a $2,000 charge at a downtown boutique. I asked him about it gently, thinking perhaps he had bought me a surprise gift. David set his glass down. The sound of heavy crystal hitting wood sounded like a judge's gavel. He looked at me not with guilt, but with a deeply unsettling mask of pity. "There is no charge, Claire," he said softly. His voice was smooth, coated in a terrifyingly convincing layer of concern. "I checked the statement this morning. You must have misread it." But I knew what I saw. I pulled out my phone to show him the alert, but the notification had simply vanished. The banking app showed no such transaction. He had already logged in, deleted the alert, and moved funds to cover his tracks. I stared at the screen, my heart beating wildly. I know I saw it, David. I really did. He stood up, slowly walked over to me, and placed his large, warm hands heavily on my shoulders. He looked down into my eyes with a gaze that made me feel completely transparent. You hunt criminals all day, Claire, he whispered. You spend 70 hours a week digging through financial dirt, looking for lies. And now you're bringing that paranoia into our home. You're seeing ghosts where there aren't any. You're turning our marriage into an interrogation. I tried to step back, but his grip tightened just enough to hold me in place. You're just imagining things, Claire, he said, his voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper. You're losing touch with reality. You're losing touch with reality. Those words became the soundtrack to my daily life. He used my own career as a weapon against me. Every time I noticed a hole in his stories, every time I caught him in a lie about his whereabouts, he threw my profession in my face. He convinced me that the stress of forensic accounting was causing paranoid delusions. This psychological terror escalated from financial discrepancies to mundane, everyday matters. I would leave my car keys on the kitchen counter, and an hour later, they would be gone. I'd later find them hidden in a drawer in the guest bathroom. When I panicked, David would shake his head, wearing that same mask of profound pity. You put them there yourself, Claire. Don't you remember? You're losing touch with reality. He began canceling my social engagements, texting my friends from my phone while I was in the shower, claiming I was too exhausted or feeling unwell. When my friends eventually stopped calling, he convinced me they were pulling away because my behavior had become erratic and unpredictable. He isolated me completely, building an invisible cage around my mind. I stopped sleeping. I walked around my own home like a stranger, constantly questioning my own memories, my own eyesight, my own sanity. At 3:00 a.m., I would stand in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my pale face and dark, sunken eyes, wondering if my husband was right, if my demanding career had finally shattered my perception of reality. Are you losing touch with reality, Claire? The phrase echoed in the shower. It resounded in the silence of my morning commute. It rang in my ears every time he kissed my forehead and told me I needed to seek psychiatric help. He was meticulously setting the stage. If I ever tried to accuse him of anything, he had already painted his masterpiece of a narrative. I was the overworked, unstable, paranoid wife. He was the patient, long-suffering husband. No one would believe a single word I said. But David made a fatal mistake. He pushed me too deep into the dark. When you corner a woman who makes a living dismantling lies, she doesn't stay blind. She adapts to the darkness. One Tuesday morning, I found a crumpled receipt for a luxury hotel stay in the pocket of his tailored suit. I didn't ask him about it. I didn't confront him. I held that small, incriminating piece of paper in my hand, and the fog in my mind instantly evaporated. The paralyzing self-doubt was replaced by a cold, sharp, and terrifying mental clarity. I wasn't crazy. I was being hunted. That realization became the catalyst. The victim he had so carefully cultivated died that morning, and the ruthless forensic auditor was resurrected. From that second on, I stopped fighting. I leaned into his manipulation. I started playing the role of the fragile, broken wife. I let him believe his psychological warfare was an absolute success, while secretly, I turned all my professional skills against him. I watched him standing by the window, entirely unaware that the woman who had just zipped up her suitcase was no longer his prey. I let him think I was losing touch with reality, just so I could wrap my hands firmly around his throat. This transformation didn't happen with a scream. It happened in absolute silence. When David left for the office that Tuesday, leaving me alone with the crumpled hotel receipt I had found in his suit, I walked into my home office and locked the door. I sat at my desk, booted up my encrypted workstation, and cracked my knuckles. The fragile, paranoid wife stayed behind that door. The woman who sat in the ergonomic chair was an apex predator in her natural habitat. David was a VP of finance, which meant that when it came to money, he thought he was the smartest guy in every room. But corporate finance and forensic accounting are two entirely different beasts. He knew how to allocate budgets and project quarterly earnings. I knew how to peel back the layers of shell companies, untangle webs of offshore wire transfers, and follow the microscopic digital footprints that arrogant men always leave behind. His first mistake was underestimating my skills. His second mistake was using our home Wi-Fi network to access his hidden life. I started with the receipt. It was from a boutique hotel in downtown Manhattan, a place known for discreet, ultra-wealthy clientele. The date matched a Thursday night when David claimed he was locked in an exhausting board meeting until 2:00 a.m. I logged into our ISP portal. David had changed his phone passcode, but he never bothered securing the router that handled the traffic from his personal devices. I pulled the network logs from that Thursday. It didn't take me long to find IP addresses linked to a secondary banking portal, completely severed from our joint accounts. He was using a boutique bank catering to high-net-worth wealth management. The security was tight, but David was predictable. He used variations of the street he grew up on, his college dorm name, and the year he defended his master's thesis for everything. Within 45 minutes, I had breached his hidden digital vault. When the main dashboard loaded, the sheer magnitude of the numbers staring back at me made my breath catch in my throat. This wasn't just a secret account for buying occasional flowers or booking cheap motels. This was a parallel universe. I exported the transaction history into a massive spreadsheet and let my fingers fly across the keyboard, creating pivot tables, categorizing expenses, and tracking routing numbers. The data painted a masterpiece of betrayal in absolute high definition. There were charges for luxury hotels. 3 nights at an exclusive resort in St. Moritz, Switzerland, which required dropping at least $5,000 a night. A charter fee for a private helicopter to the French Riviera. And jewelry. The $20,000 bill for a diamond bracelet from Paris was just the beginning. I found invoices for custom emerald earrings from Cartier and a vintage Rolex watch. He was spending money with the recklessness of a lottery winner, pumping hundreds of thousands of dollars into a life from which I was completely excluded. But who was wearing these diamonds? I cross-referenced the St. Moritz travel dates with his corporate travel schedule. The flight records on his end were heavily redacted, but I accessed airline booking patterns using a backdoor search methodology I normally applied to corporate audits. 2 first-class tickets had been booked with his corporate card, later reimbursed from this hidden account. The second passenger's name was perfectly visible in the raw data. Chloe. The name hit me like a physical blow, yet it made absolute, sickening sense. Chloe, his 28-year-old executive assistant. The girl who always greeted me with an overly enthusiastic smile and a high-pitched voice whenever I visited the office. The girl who sent us a lovely fruit basket for our wedding anniversary. I closed my eyes and pictured her flawless manicure and designer clothes that always seemed just a little too expensive for her salary. She wasn't just bringing him coffee. She was wearing Cartier necklaces. She was drinking champagne on the French Riviera. A weaker woman would have taken screenshots, printed the pages, and thrown them in his face the second he walked through the door. A weaker woman would have screamed, demanded a divorce, and fought for the house. But I wasn't looking for a messy divorce. The deeper I dug into the spreadsheet, the more I realized that the infidelity was merely a symptom of a much more severe disease. The math simply didn't add up. David made excellent money, but not enough to sustain this insane level of luxury without draining our marital assets, which remained untouched. The money in this hidden account was coming from offshore wire transfers, funneled through 3 different shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. I spent the next 48 hours barely sleeping, fueled by black coffee and a burning, ice-cold rage. I traced the Cayman companies back to their source. They turned out to be vendor accounts directly tied to his pharmaceutical conglomerate. David was creating fake supply chain invoices, approving them as the VP of Finance, and siphoning corporate funds straight into his secret account. He wasn't just a cheating husband, he was a corporate thief committing massive wire fraud, pursued by federal authorities. When I finally leaned back in my chair, staring at the completed schematic of his crimes, I felt a strange, profound peace. The tears were gone. The self-doubt was completely obliterated. He had tried to convince me I was losing my mind, but my intellect had never been sharper. It was in that exact moment I decided to forge my pain into a weapon. I became a ghost in my own home. When David returned from work that evening, complaining about a stressful day, I greeted him with a warm, sympathetic smile. I took his coat, poured his scotch. I listened to his lies with wide, supportive eyes. Whenever he employed his favorite manipulation tactics, deliberately moving my keys or denying conversations we definitely had, I played my part flawlessly. I let my voice tremble. I apologized for my failing memory. I agreed that my job was making me too stressed and paranoid. I gave him exactly what he wanted, a broken, submissive, clueless wife. Behind his back, I systematically archived every single document, every wire transfer, every forged invoice onto a highly encrypted, offline server. I built an ironclad dossier that wouldn't just guarantee me an incredibly favorable asset split in a divorce, more importantly, it would guarantee him a long, brutal sentence in a maximum security federal prison. I watched him text Chloe under the table during dinner, and instead of breaking with pain, I felt the cold, thrilling anticipation of a hunter watching a wolf willingly step into steel jaws. He thought he was a brilliant strategist controlling the whole chessboard. He had no idea I was the one who rigged the game. This charade lasted for exactly 3 weeks before David finally made his move. It was a Friday evening. I was standing in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a roast, maintaining the illusion of domestic normalcy. The front door opened, and David walked in, radiating an energy that instantly put me on high alert. He was practically vibrating with manic, artificially manufactured excitement. He walked straight into the kitchen, wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, and kissed the side of my neck. I forced my muscles to relax, leaning into his embrace while my mind raced at top speed, trying to calculate what game he was playing. He spun me around and tossed a glossy, heavy cardstock travel agency brochure onto the marble island. The cover featured an overwater bungalow suspended above a crystal-clear turquoise ocean. The Maldives, he announced, his voice practically singing with delight. I booked us 2 first-class tickets for next Thursday. We're spending 10 days at a private island resort. Just you, me, and the Indian Ocean. I stared at the brochure in rehearsed, calculated shock. The Maldives? David, that's incredibly expensive. And what about your quarter-end closings? He waved his hand dismissively, pulling me into another tight hug. Closings can wait. You can't. We've had a rough patch lately, Claire. I know I've been distant. And I know you've been struggling with a lot of stress and anxiety. I want to save our marriage. I want to take you away from all this so we can reconnect and remember why we fell in love. It was a masterful performance. If I hadn't spent the last month tracing his embezzlement scheme and reading luxury hotel receipts for his 2-8-year-old mistress, I might have wept tears of joy. Instead, I let my eyes gloss over with fake gratitude. I hugged him back, burying my face in his chest so he couldn't see my blood-curdling glare. Thank you, I whispered. This is exactly what we needed. He pulled back, still keeping his hands on my shoulders, and gave me a slightly apologetic smile. There is just one small catch, he said smoothly. The flights I booked have an overnight layover in Dubai. The European board dropped a massive, urgent meeting into the schedule for Friday morning. I told them I couldn't make it, but they insisted someone from the executive team be on the ground to hand-deliver the physical financial projections. So, I'm sending Chloe. The name hung in the air between us. Chloe. My husband was taking me on a luxury vacation to save our marriage and bringing his mistress on the exact same flight. The sheer audacity of the lie literally took my breath away. Sending an assistant to Dubai to hand-deliver physical financial projections to board members in the era of encrypted digital files was an excuse so flimsy it was insulting. He was treating me like a complete idiot. But I remembered the first rule of forensic accounting: when a suspect hands you a forged ledger, you don't throw it back in his face. You accept it with a smile and use it to build a cage around him. Oh, I said, maintaining a light tone, completely devoid of any suspicion. Is she sitting with us? David laughed, shaking his head. Of course not. She's flying economy. We're in first class. She'll grab her bags in Dubai, head to the corporate office, and we'll catch our connecting flight to Malé. You won't even notice she's there. I promise. I nodded, giving him a radiant, trusting smile. Well, if it secures your job and gets us to the beach, I think it's fine. He kissed my forehead, called me the most understanding wife in the world, and went upstairs to shower. I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the glossy brochure. The Maldives is an extradition nightmare. It's a country where an American citizen could easily disappear, or where a fatal accident could occur far outside the jurisdiction of the U.S. justice system. But David wasn't the type to get his hands dirty with physical violence. He was a finance guy. He operated on traps, leverage, and paper trails. If he was bringing Chloe along, this wasn't a murder plot. It was a frame job. He needed me to permanently exit the picture. And for that, he needed a witness or an accomplice to help him execute it during our trip. The digital clock on my nightstand flipped from 1:59 to 2:00 a.m. The sharp red glow illuminated the contours of our bedroom, casting long shadows across the floor. I lay completely motionless on my side of the massive king bed, facing the wall. I regulated my breathing, drawing air in through my nose and letting it out through my mouth in a slow, steady rhythm. I had to mimic the deep sleep of a wife who believed her husband was taking her on a romantic getaway. My eyes were closed, but my senses were heightened to an almost painful degree. I was like a taut string, vibrating with anticipation. The mattress shifted. The sudden absence of David's weight sent a cold draft of air straight down my spine. I maintained my steady breathing. I didn't flinch. I didn't move a single muscle. I opened my eyelids a fraction of a millimeter, peering through my eyelashes into the dimly lit room. David stood beside the bed, his silhouette stark against the moonlight filtering through the blinds. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, looking down at me, checking to see if his movement had woken me up. I let out a soft, sleepy sigh and shifted my head slightly on the pillow, playing the role of the exhausted woman he believed me to be. Satisfied, he turned away. Moving with practiced, predatory silence, he crossed the room and entered his walk-in closet. I heard the soft rustle of fabric, followed by the metallic click of his floor safe being unlocked. When he emerged a minute later, he was holding something massive in his hands. It was a rectangular block, roughly the size of a thick textbook, completely wrapped in matte black electrical tape. Even in the gloom, the package looked heavy and dense. It looked exactly like the kind of contraband laid out on metal tables during DEA drug busts. He carried the black brick to the corner of the room, where my elegant, open black suitcase sat waiting for him. My heart hammered against my ribcage in such a frantic, violent rhythm that I was terrified he would hear it from across the room. "You're losing touch with reality, Claire." The phrase echoed loudly, mockingly, in the empty chambers of my mind. This was the exact moment his psychological warfare fully materialized into a physical threat. He wasn't just manipulating me to cover up a cheap office affair. He was orchestrating my absolute annihilation. David knelt beside my suitcase, reached into the pocket of his sweatpants, and pulled out a small, sharp utility knife. With horrifying fascination, I watched my husband carefully push aside the clothes I had packed just hours earlier. He located the zipper at the base of the suitcase's shell, the one granting access to the internal structural lining. He unzipped it halfway, but the opening wasn't wide enough to accommodate the massive black package. Without a second of hesitation, David pressed the blade of the utility knife against the thick nylon fabric. He sliced the lining. The tearing sound was quite a delicate hiss of snapping threads, but to me, it sounded like a gunshot. It was the sound of the permanent severing of my marriage. He shoved the heavy, tape-wrapped bag deep into the empty space between the hard plastic shell and the fabric lining. He pressed it flat, maneuvering the corners to ensure no suspicious bulges formed. As soon as the package was perfectly hidden, he smoothed the sliced lining back into place and meticulously rearranged my dresses and swimsuits over the hidden compartment. He zipped the main compartment shut, patting the top of the suitcase in a sickeningly triumphant gesture. "You're losing touch with reality, Claire." The voice in my head was deafening now. The sheer scale of his betrayal washed over me like ice water. He wasn't just planning to divorce me and leave me for his young secretary. He was sending me to a foreign prison, to a jurisdiction known for zero tolerance regarding drug offenses, a place where an American woman would vanish into a nightmare of concrete and steel. If his plan succeeded, I would be detained at an international border checkpoint. I would be dragged into a fluorescent-lit interrogation room, screaming my innocence, while foreign authorities pulled a brick of hard narcotics out of my personal luggage. David would stand by, playing the horrified husband. He would shake his head in disbelief, telling authorities his wife had been acting erratically lately, that she had lost touch with reality. He would use the mental instability he had manufactured himself to seal my fate. I would be locked away for decades, and he would return to New York as a tragic hero free to inherit my life insurance, payouts, our home, and the millions he stole from his company. With his mistress by his side, the cruelty of the plan was breathtaking. It was a sociopathic calculation that defied any basic human empathy. He wanted me to spend the rest of my life rotting in a cage, questioning my own sanity. He stretched, reaching his arms above his head and letting out a quiet, satisfied exhale. The executioner had set the trap. He returned to his side of the bed, slipped under the covers, and settled onto the pillows. Within 10 minutes, his breathing deepened, settling into a steady rhythm. He slept like a baby. He slept like a man who carried no weight of a ruined life on his conscience. He had just signed my death warrant, using a utility knife and a roll of electrical tape. Yet his chest rose and fell in perfect harmony. I lay in the dark with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. I didn't cry. The fragile, paranoid wife he had tried to create in me was completely dead. The woman lying next to him in the shadows was someone else entirely. My pain had crystallized into something cold, hard, and terrifyingly precise. I waited another 30 minutes to ensure he was fully submerged in deep sleep. The apartment was dead silent. I slowly slid the covers off my shoulders. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor. This game was no longer his. The midnight betrayal was complete, and now it was my turn to move. The hardwood floor was ice cold against my bare feet. As I walked away from the bed, I didn't look back at David. His deep, rhythmic breathing filled the room, a sound that used to bring me comfort, and now only solidified my resolve. I moved with the quiet, practiced grace of a shadow, crossing the expansive bedroom toward the corner where my elegant black suitcase waited. The moonlight poured through the wooden blinds, illuminating the luggage like evidence at a crime scene. I knelt beside the suitcase, pressing my knees into the plush wool rug. My hands hovered over the zipper. I had to be meticulous. Every movement required the precision of a surgeon operating on an unstable patient. I slowly unzipped it millimeter by millimeter, ensuring the metal teeth made absolutely no sound. The scent of my expensive floral perfume wafted up from the carefully folded clothes, a drastic contrast to the betrayal buried just beneath them. I carefully lifted the top layer of silk dresses and linen pants, setting them aside in the exact configuration they were packed in. I reached the bottom lining of the suitcase. My fingers glided over the nylon fabric until they felt the fresh, jagged slice David had made just minutes prior. My heart beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands remained completely steady. I slipped my fingers into the dark cavity between the hard polycarbonate shell and the fabric lining. The package was dense and hard. It felt like a block of solid concrete. I grabbed the edges of the black electrical tape and slowly began pulling it out of the tight space. The friction of the tape against the nylon produced a soft, scratching sound that made me instantly freeze. I held my breath, listening intently. David's snoring broke for a second, then returned to its steady rhythm. I let out a slow, controlled stream of air and completely extracted the package. It weighed at least 3 pounds. Holding it in my hands, the reality of my husband's sociopathy became a physical weight. I clutched the black brick to my chest and stood up. I bypassed our en-suite bathroom, knowing the bright lights in proximity to the bed were too big a risk. Instead, I soundlessly slipped out into the hallway and headed for my home office at the other end of the apartment. I stepped inside, closed the heavy mahogany door, and turned the lock, which gave a soft, final click. I switched on a small desk lamp, casting a concentrated pool of warm yellow light across my polished glass desktop. I placed the black package dead center in the illuminated circle. The electrical tape was wrapped in overlapping, chaotic layers, designed so that any tampering would be immediately obvious. But forensic examiners are trained to dismantle complex structures without leaving the slightest trace. I opened my desk drawer and took out a specialized craft scalpel I used for precision document binding. I sat down, leaning close over the package. I examined the seams of the tape, looking for the trailing edge where David had finished wrapping. I found it hidden on the underside. Holding my breath, I slipped the razor-sharp scalpel blade under the adhesive. I applied a microscopic amount of pressure, slicing upward in a perfectly straight line. The thick tape parted smoothly. I peeled back the heavy black layers one by one, working with monstrous patience to preserve the sticky integrity of the adhesive so it could be seamlessly resealed later. Beneath the electrical tape was a thick layer of industrial vacuum-sealed plastic. Through the transparent material, I saw it. The white powder was packed incredibly tight, compressed into a solid, chalky mass. My blood turned to ice in my veins, chilling me to the bone. I am a financial investigator, not a narcotics expert, but the sheer volume of the synthetic substance staring back at me was unmistakable. This wasn't a personal use quantity, this was a commercial trafficking amount. My mind instantly calculated the legal ramifications. The Maldives operates under strict Islamic law. International transit through Dubai or London with this quantity of synthetic drugs triggers mandatory, draconian minimum sentences. David didn't just want me arrested. He was sentencing me to life in a brutal foreign prison. He wanted me locked in a concrete cell, stripped of my rights, my career, and my freedom, completely unable to defend myself while he played the grieving husband in New York. The pure, breathtaking malice required to execute such a plan made my hands tremble for a fraction of a second. I stared at the powder, my mind racing through his strategy. But something didn't sit right. The package was thick, but the weight distribution felt slightly uneven when I carried it down the hall. My investigative instincts suddenly sharpened. You never look only at the numbers on the surface. You always check what is buried deep beneath the ledgers. I pressed my thumbs into the tightly sealed plastic, probing the dense block of powder. The surface was hard, but as I ran my fingers along the bottom edge, I felt a distinct, unnatural bulge. It was small, rectangular, and completely rigid. That wasn't a clump of drugs, that was hardware. Using the scalpel, I made a microscopic, imperceptible incision in the very corner of the vacuum seal. The hiss of escaping air was barely audible. I massaged the compressed powder, shifting the white mass just enough to push the hidden object toward the opening. A small, black object slid out of the powder and hit the glass surface of my desk with a soft clink. It was a flash drive. The device was sleek, heavily reinforced, and bore the logo of a military-grade encryption hardware manufacturer. It was the kind of drive top-tier executives used to transport sensitive trade secrets across hostile borders. I stared at the device, and my analytical mind snapped the final pieces of the puzzle together. David was a genius in corporate finance, but he suffered from the ultimate flaw of arrogant men. He wanted to take the whole pot. He didn't just want to frame me for drug smuggling. He wanted to frame me for his own embezzlement. If authorities detained me at the airport, they would confiscate the drugs, and this flash drive would be seized as physical evidence. When they cracked the encryption, they would find the financial ledgers, the offshore account numbers, and the digital trail of the $8 million missing from his pharmaceutical company. All of it neatly packed in my suitcase. The authorities would conclude that I was the mastermind, the paranoid, unstable wife who embezzled millions and tried to flee the country with a bag full of narcotics. David would be completely cleared of all charges, painted as the tragic victim of his own wife's hidden criminal empire. He would keep the real money safe in an offshore account, clear his name at the company, and walk away entirely unscathed. I picked up the flash drive. It was cold to the touch. A lethal digital weapon designed to bury my reputation alongside my freedom. I brushed a few specks of white powder off the metal casing. The betrayal was so profound, so meticulously evil, that it transcended mere anger. It transformed into absolute, terrifying clarity. He wanted an information war. He wanted to use digital forensics to dig my grave. He brought a knife to a gunfight. I gripped the flash drive tightly in my hand as I booted up my heavily encrypted laptop. It was time to see just how much rope my husband had given me to hang him with. The cold metal of the flash drive slid into the port of my heavily modified laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, pale blue light across my face. A sleek, minimalist password prompt materialized in the center of the display. It was military-grade encryption, the kind of security designed to completely wipe the drive if the wrong password was entered 10 times in a row. David had purchased top-tier security, but he suffered from the fatal arrogance of a man who considered his wife technologically illiterate. He thought I spent my days balancing simple ledgers. He didn't realize my daily routine consisted of dismantling the encrypted financial fortresses of corrupt millionaires. I didn't waste my limited attempts guessing his childhood pets or favorite scotch. Instead, I launched a proprietary decryption protocol I had engineered years ago to penetrate offshore tax havens. Lines of green code began cascading down my screen in a rapid, mesmerizing waterfall. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, sipping a glass of ice water, and watched my software systematically dismantle his expensive digital lock. The silence in the house was absolute, save for the low, rhythmic hum of my laptop's cooling fan. Every passing minute felt like an hour. I kept one ear tuned to the hallway, listening for the creak of floorboards that would signal David had woken up and found an empty bed. But he slept deeply, lulled by the pure confidence of his own sociopathy. 7 minutes later, a sharp, satisfying click echoed from the computer's speakers. The encryption barrier fell. The drive successfully mounted onto my desktop. I opened the root directory. There were 3 separate folders, neatly organized with the same clinical precision David applied to everything. The first folder was labeled with the name of a dormant pharmaceutical research project. I clicked on it. A massive, complex spreadsheet filled the screen. It was the master ledger. My eyes swept over the rows and columns, instantly translating the raw data into a horrifying narrative. It perfectly mirrored the preliminary embezzlement trail I had discovered weeks ago. But the scale was exponentially larger than I had calculated. David hadn't just siphoned off a few $100,000 for luxury trips with Chloe. He had been systematically bleeding his company dry over a 4-year period. He had created an elaborate network of fake vendors, generating bogus invoices for chemical raw materials that never existed. The funds were approved by his own department, dispersed to Delaware shell companies, and immediately wired into a labyrinth of offshore holding accounts. I highlighted the final column and summed the totals. Total stolen assets amounted to exactly $8 million. I opened the second folder. This one contained a series of text documents filled with seemingly random strings of words, recovery phrases. David hadn't left those $8 million in vulnerable international bank accounts. He had meticulously converted the stolen fiat currency into untraceable cryptocurrency. He had splintered the fortune and stored it across multiple cold wallets. The digital keys required to access those wallets sat right here on this drive. With these phrases, he could access his stolen empire from a laptop anywhere on Earth, from a private villa in the Maldives, a paradise with no extradition treaty. The sheer magnitude of his greed was breathtaking, but it was the contents of the third folder that made the blood freeze in my veins. The folder was simply named Archive. I opened it and found a cache of fabricated digital evidence. There were drafted emails, spoofed to look as though they were sent from my personal IP address. The messages were directed to shady overseas chemical suppliers, discussing the logistics of moving synthetic narcotics. There was even a forged digital confession, written in my tone, expressing deep remorse that I had let financial greed push me into international drug smuggling. David had crafted an alternate reality where I was the criminal mastermind. The entirety of his scheme finally snapped together, forming a devastatingly perfect mechanism designed to erase my existence. The heavy package of drugs in my suitcase was merely the physical bait. When the airport drug dogs inevitably flagged my luggage, authorities would tear it apart. They would find the massive quantity of synthetic drugs and this heavily encrypted drive. When international cybercrime units cracked the drive, they would discover the $8 million corporate theft and the fabricated emails linking me to both crimes. The authorities would look at my career as a forensic accountant and conclude I possessed the exact skill set required to pull off such a massive corporate heist. They would assume I used the stolen corporate funds to buy narcotics, attempting to flee the country and start a new life. David would stand in the airport terminal, playing the terrified, betrayed husband. He would fully cooperate with authorities, tearfully handing over any information they asked for. I would be tried and convicted in a foreign jurisdiction known for its draconian justice system. I would be locked in a concrete cell for the rest of my natural life, completely silenced, unable to defend myself against a mountain of digital evidence planted in my own luggage. A life sentence in a foreign prison is essentially a death sentence. Back in New York, David would reap the ultimate rewards. As the innocent, grieving spouse, he would retain control of our assets. He would cash out my substantial life insurance policies. The pharmaceutical company, convinced they had caught the rogue accountant responsible for the theft, would close their internal investigations. David's name would be entirely cleared. He would wait a respectable mourning period, and then he would quietly disappear. He would fly to a beautiful, sun-drenched island with his young secretary, accessing his $8 million in untraceable crypto. They would live like royalty on the ashes of my destroyed life. It was a flawless execution strategy, assuming the victim was an oblivious, trusting wife who would blindly carry a tampered suitcase into an international airport. But David profoundly underestimated his opponent. He thought he was playing chess against a pawn. He didn't realize I had already flipped the entire board upside down. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. The initial shock completely evaporated, replaced by absolute, ice-cold determination. He wanted to destroy me with data. He wanted to use my own profession to dig my grave. I reached for my encrypted external hard drive and plugged it into the laptop. I began copying every single file, every recovery phrase, every fabricated email, and the master ledger of his theft. I was taking his ammunition. I was taking his future. I was taking his life. The transfer progress bar glowed neon green on my screen, a steady, relentless march toward 100%. I watched as every single byte of David's stolen empire flowed from his heavily encrypted hardware straight onto my hidden server. I had built this untraceable cloud architecture years ago to protect whistleblower documents and track offshore corporate fraud. It resided on servers in jurisdictions that would never yield to a subpoena from any government agency. Now, it held the digital death warrant for my husband. The file transfer completed with a crisp, hollow chime. I safely ejected the flash drive and pulled it from the port. It felt entirely different in my hand now. It was no longer a secret. It was a loaded weapon. I looked down at the black brick of synthetic drugs resting on my glass desk. A normal person, a civilian untouched by the brutal realities of the justice system, would have immediately grabbed their smartphone. They would have dialed 911, begging the police to come to the house, frantically pointing at the drugs and the husband sleeping in the master bedroom. But I am not a civilian, I am a forensic accountant. I have spent my life in interrogation rooms and federal courthouse corridors, watching highly paid defense attorneys twist reality until the truth becomes utterly unrecognizable. If I called the police right now, David would wake up. He would rub his eyes and play the role of the confused victim. He would look at the officers with that practiced expression of pity. He would tell them I had been acting erratically for months. He would claim he had never seen the package in his life. He would suggest, his voice trembling, that my demanding job had finally caused a nervous breakdown, and somehow I had acquired these drugs during a manic episode. Without hard, irrefutable proof that he placed that package in my bag, the narrative would devolve into a muddy, chaotic domestic dispute. He had corporate standing, expensive suits, and a carefully cultivated reputation as a dedicated VP. I would be a hysterical wife holding 3 pounds of narcotics in my own home office. The risk was simply unacceptable. David had to be caught in a scenario where his guilt was absolute. He had to be caught red-handed, completely stripped of any ability to weave a fabricated story. He had to walk into a trap designed so perfectly that even the most expensive corporate lawyers in Manhattan wouldn't be able to save him. I wouldn't allow him to negotiate a plea deal with a prosecutor or hide behind plausible deniability. I would let his own greed and arrogance walk him straight to the slaughter. I picked up the flash drive and slid it back into the tiny incision I had made in the vacuum-sealed plastic. I pressed it deep into the compressed white powder, ensuring it was buried exactly where he had placed it. Next, I reached into my craft drawer and pulled out a roll of matte black electrical tape. I bought this specific type for binding heavy, thick financial dossiers. It was an exact replica of the tape David had used. I worked with the calm, measured precision of a bomb technician. I applied fresh tape over the incision, pressing it flat, smoothing out any microscopic air bubbles or creases. I replicated the chaotic, overlapping pattern he had used, ensuring the visual integrity of the package remained completely undisturbed. When I finished, I held the heavy black brick under the desk lamp. It was flawless. David could inspect it closely and never suspect it had been opened, decrypted, and weaponized against him. I carried the heavy package back down the dark hallway, my bare feet padding soundlessly against the hardwood. The master bedroom looked exactly as I had left it. The moonlight still painted long shadows across the wool rug. David was still snoring softly, his chest rising and falling in deep, oblivious sleep. I knelt beside my open black suitcase. I didn't put the package back into the lining. That was his plan, not mine. Instead, I left the lining perfectly sliced open and pressed the folded clothes back into place to make it look as though the package was still hidden underneath. I zipped the suitcase all the way shut. I took the black brick and walked into my walk-in closet, hiding it deep inside my large leather tote bag. The tote bag I would carry right by my side during the morning commute to the airport. The decision to let his own arrogance destroy him wrapped around me like a heavy, comforting blanket. I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to orchestrate a spectacular, public annihilation. I would let him walk into the international terminal, believing he was the smartest man in the world. I would let him feel the intoxicating thrill of his impending victory, and then, at the very last possible second, I would perform the ultimate magic trick. He wanted to use Chloe as a prop, a naive secretary to escape with while I was locked in a foreign cell. It was only fair that she became the vessel of his downfall. I walked into the ensuite bathroom and turned on the cold water tap. I splashed freezing water on my face, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was unrecognizable. She bore no resemblance to the devoted wife who had lived in this apartment for 5 years. Her eyes were dark, flat, and completely devoid of mercy. I dried my face with a towel and walked back into the bedroom. I slipped under the covers, pulling the heavy fabric up to my shoulders. I lay mere inches away from the man who had so actively planned my demise. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. I could hear the soft, rhythmic sound of his breathing. I felt no fear whatsoever. I felt a deep, blood-curdling anticipation. The trap was set. The evidence secured. The strategy operational. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to drift into a light, calculating sleep. Tomorrow morning, the sun would rise over the Manhattan skyline, and I would wake up and play the loving, unsuspecting wife one last time. I would smile at him over coffee. I would hold his hand in the back of the car, and I would watch as he gleefully marched toward his own absolute destruction. Morning arrived with the harsh blare of the alarm clock. David was already awake, bustling around the bedroom with an irritating level of energy. He kissed my cheek, handed me a mug of coffee, and told me to get dressed because our private car was already waiting downstairs. I played my role flawlessly. I stretched, gave him a sleepy, grateful smile, and told him how excited I was. I grabbed my leather tote bag from the closet, feeling the dense weight of the black brick resting securely at the bottom, hidden beneath my laptop and a cashmere scarf. David grabbed my black suitcase, carrying it down the stairs with exaggerated care. He thought he was carrying his golden ticket. He had no idea he was carrying an empty shell. We stepped out into the crisp, New York morning. A luxury SUV with the engine running idled at the curb. The driver stepped out to open the trunk, but David insisted on loading my black suitcase himself. He placed it gently in the back, giving it a satisfied pat before closing the hatch. I watched him from the curb, hugging my tote bag to my chest, masking my cold anticipation with a radiant vacation smile. David opened the rear passenger door for me. I slid onto the leather seat, and that's when I saw her. Chloe was sitting in the front passenger seat. She turned around, flashing me a brilliant, perfectly glossed smile. "Good morning, Claire," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "David mentioned it would be more efficient to ride to the airport together since my flight to Dubai leaves around the same time as your flight to the Maldives. I hope you don't mind." I forced my face to soften into an expression of pleasant surprise. "Not at all, Chloe," I replied in a calm, airy voice. "It makes perfect sense. We're all heading to the exact same place." David slid into the back seat next to me, pulling the heavy door shut. The SUV pulled away from the curb, beginning the journey to JFK Airport. The interior of the vehicle was suffocatingly quiet at first, filled only with the low hum of the engine. The spatial dynamic was an absolute masterpiece of betrayal. David sat shoulder to shoulder with his wife, while his mistress sat mere feet away in the front seat. I kept my gaze focused on the rearview mirror. I could clearly see Chloe's reflection. She wasn't looking at the road. She was looking at David. Every few minutes, her eyes would dart to the mirror, catching his gaze. A subtle, mocking smirk played on her lips. She was reveling in it. She loved the thrill of sitting in the same car as the clueless wife, sharing a secret, deadly joke with the man who was about to destroy my life. David was savoring it too. He reached over and took my hand, intertwining his fingers with mine. "You look beautiful this morning, Claire," he said, rubbing his thumb over the back of my hand. "This trip is going to change everything for us. We're going to leave all our heavy baggage behind here in New York and just focus on the future." The dramatic irony of his words hung in the tight space of the SUV. He thought he was serving me a clever pun about leaving his marriage and me in a prison cell. I looked at him, squeezing his hand tightly. "I completely agree with you, David," I said, matching his sincere tone. "I already feel lighter. It's amazing how much better a person feels when they finally let go of the things dragging them down." Chloe's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror for a fraction of a second. Her smirk widened. She thought my response was pathetic, a desperate grasping at straws by a woman trying to save a doomed marriage. She turned her head slightly toward the passenger window, hiding a quiet snort. "Are you ready for that big board meeting in Dubai?" I asked Chloe, leaning forward slightly. "David says you're handling some incredibly sensitive financial projections. That must be a lot of pressure, carrying all that corporate weight all by yourself." Chloe shifted in her seat, adjusting her expensive designer scarf. "Oh, it's nothing I can't handle, Claire. David trusts me implicitly with his most valuable assets. I know exactly how to execute his plans." She glanced at David in the mirror again, her eyes gleaming with malicious joy. David let out a low, rumbling laugh, patting my knee. "Chloe is a professional, Claire. She always delivers exactly what I ask for without leaving a single margin for error. That's why she's absolutely indispensable to my operations." They were practically high-fiving each other in front of my face. The sheer arrogance required to mock me so openly was staggering. They felt invincible. They believed they were predators playing with their food right before the slaughter. I leaned back against the leather seat, resting my hand on the tote bag in my lap. Through the thick material, my fingertips brushed against the hard outline of the black tape-wrapped package. "It's so important to have people you can trust," I murmured, staring out the window at the passing highway traffic. "Especially when you're dealing with things that could ruin your life if they ever got out. You really have to be careful about who ends up holding your baggage." The luxury SUV hit a slight bump. David withdrew his hand to check a quick notification on his phone. "We're making great time," he announced. "We'll be at Terminal 4 in 20 minutes. The security lines there are an absolute breeze. We'll all sail right through today without a hitch." I just smiled at my reflection in the tinted glass. He was right about one thing. Everything was about to change forever. The luxury SUV glided to a smooth stop in front of the glass and steel facade of Terminal 4. A uniformed porter immediately approached the vehicle, but David waved him off with a sharp, nervous gesture. He insisted on handling the luggage himself, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the handle of my black suitcase. He pulled it from the trunk with such reverence you'd think it contained the crown jewels. As he carefully set it on the concrete, Chloe retrieved her pristine Louis Vuitton rolling bag, its wheels gliding soundlessly over the pavement. I stepped out into the biting New York wind, hugging my heavy leather tote tightly against my side. The black brick of narcotics rested securely at the bottom, an anchor pulling me toward the inevitable climax. We walked through the sliding glass doors, away from the chaotic crowds of the main concourse. David bypassed the standard check-in counters, steering us straight toward the frosted glass entrance of the exclusive VIP lounge. It was a sanctuary designed for the elite, a place where wealthy travelers could sip espresso and drink complimentary champagne before facing the minor inconvenience of the priority security checkpoint located just beyond the lounge. Exit. The heavy glass doors slid open, effectively muting the frantic noise of the airport. The VIP area was wrapped in an atmosphere of quiet privilege. Soft jazz played from invisible speakers. Executives typed silently on laptops, while staff in crisp vests circulated with silver trays. David chose a secluded seating area in the far corner, surrounded by high frosted glass partitions that provided a strategic dose of privacy. 10 minutes passed in a suffocating silence. The tension radiating from David was so palpable it felt like a physical weight in the air. He pulled his phone from his pocket, stared at the blank screen, and suddenly gasped with fabricated surprise. "It's the board in Dubai," he announced, his voice tight with manufactured urgency. "They must be reviewing the preliminary financials right now. I need to take this call before we go through security. This might take a few minutes." He stood up abruptly, pointing to a row of soundproof glass phone booths on the opposite side of the VIP lounge. "Order a mimosa, Claire," he instructed, forcing a stiff smile. "I'll be right back, and then we'll head straight to the gate." I watched him walk away at a brisk pace, his back rigid, quote, resembling a marching soldier going to talk to a dial tone. He stepped into the soundproof booth and turned his back to our seating area, pressing the phone to his ear in a desperate pantomime of a corporate crisis. I was left alone with Chloe. She sat across from me, scrolling through her social media feeds with an expression of profound boredom. She didn't even bother making conversation. In her mind, I was already a ghost. I was a naive, easily disposable obstacle standing between her and a stolen fortune. She sighed heavily, locked her phone screen, and tossed it into her purse. "I need to touch up my lipstick," Chloe announced, not even looking at me. "This dry air in here is a nightmare." She stood up, smoothing out the creases in her expensive silk blouse. She didn't take her Louis Vuitton suitcase with her. Why would she? She was leaving it under the supervision of a woman she considered completely harmless, a woman too oblivious to notice her own husband slipping right through her fingers. Chloe spun on her heel and strutted confidently toward the luxury restrooms, down a short, curved hallway near the lounge entrance. I watched her figure disappear around the corner. I shifted my gaze back to the soundproof booth. David was still facing the wall, gesturing animatedly to an imaginary board of directors. I was completely alone. Adrenaline surged into my bloodstream like a violent electrical discharge. My heart pounded against my ribs with a force that threatened to shatter my chest. My vision narrowed, cutting out the soft jazz, the hum of conversations, and the clinking of champagne glasses. The entire world shrank down to the pristine designer bag sitting exactly 16 inches from my right foot. My internal clock began a relentless, unforgiving countdown. I had exactly 3 minutes. 3 minutes before Chloe finished touching up her makeup. 3 minutes before David concluded his theatrical phone call. 3 minutes to execute the most dangerous transaction of my life. I didn't panic. The forensic accountant took absolute control of my nervous system. I operate in fractions of a second, in tight windows of time, in the spaces where greedy people become vulnerable. I took a deep, silent breath, filling my lungs with oxygen. I casually shifted my weight, sliding to the very edge of the leather armchair. I unzipped my large tote bag. I plunged my hand deep into the dark interior, bypassing my laptop and the cashmere scarf. My fingers brushed against the rough, unmistakable texture of the black electrical tape. The brick of synthetic narcotics was heavy, cold, and waiting. I gripped it tightly, preparing to pull the trigger on the trap that would tear their lives apart piece by piece. The 3-minute window was rapidly closing. The VIP lounge remained peaceful. No one was looking in my direction. The business travelers were engrossed in their screens. The staff was busy at the buffet. The stage was perfectly, beautifully empty. I cast one last glance at the hallway leading to the restrooms. Empty. I looked at the soundproof booth. David still had his back turned. The countdown ticked relentlessly in my head. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The stakes had never been higher, and my hands had never been steadier. I pulled the black package out of my tote, keeping it low and hiding it beneath the folds of my long trench coat. The moment of absolute destruction had officially begun. I slid out of the leather armchair and onto the thick carpeted floor in one fluid motion. From the perspective of travelers across the lounge, I just looked like a woman bending down to adjust her shoe. But from my vantage point behind the frosted glass partition, I had unhindered access to the pristine Louis Vuitton suitcase resting on the carpet. 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. The designer luggage practically taunted me with its interlocking monogram pattern. Chloe had positioned the bag so the main zipper faced outward, completely unsecured. She was so confident in her safety, so utterly absorbed in her delusions of an impending tropical triumph, that she hadn't even bothered to lock the small brass padlock dangling from the side handle. I reached out and grabbed the custom gold zipper pulls. The metal was ice cold against my skin. I pulled the zippers apart. The luxury hardware glided open without the slightest resistance, parting in absolute silence. The interior of Chloe's suitcase smelled of strikingly expensive floral perfume and fresh leather. My eyes swept over the contents with the rapid, calculating efficiency of an auditor processing a physical ledger. She packed with sloppy arrogance. Tangled silk nightgowns lay haphazardly over designer swimwear. A velvet jewelry pouch sat brazenly right on top. I pushed my hand past her expensive clothes, reaching deep into the bottom frame of the suitcase. I needed a compartment deep enough to conceal a 3-pound brick of synthetic drugs and the evidence of corporate treason. I found a secondary zipper running along the spine of the luggage, an internal lining compartment designed for damp clothes or shoes. I grabbed the small plastic tab and pulled. The space inside was perfectly empty. I retrieved the tape-wrapped package from the folds of my trench coat. The brick felt exponentially heavier now that it was completely exposed. Inside it lay a life sentence. Inside it lay the $8 million David had bled from his company. Inside it lay the digital, fabricated emails meant to bury me in a foreign prison. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the heavy black package deep into the inner cavity of Chloe's designer bag. I pressed the brick flat against the hard polycarbonate spine, maneuvering the corners so they fit perfectly into the spaces above the wheels. I pressed my hands against the thick plastic, feeling the vacuum-sealed narcotics settle into the foundation of the luggage. I smoothed the inner nylon lining over the package, making sure no unnatural bulges protruded. It fit flawlessly. The weight of my husband's betrayal had officially been transferred. 1 minute and 20 seconds left. I grabbed the internal zipper and pulled it shut, sealing the drugs and the encrypted flash drive in the safe darkness. I quickly rearranged her tangled silk nightgowns, laying them back over the bottom lining in the exact same chaotic disarray she had left them in. I brought the 2 gold exterior zippers together, completely closing the Louis Vuitton bag. I adjusted the handles to sit at the precise angle Chloe had left them. I slipped back into my leather armchair, my heart hammering against my ribs in a brutal rhythm. My hands trembled slightly from the massive adrenaline spike. I wiped my sweaty palms on the fabric of my trousers, grabbed the stem of my mimosa glass, and took a deep, steadying breath. The physical swap took exactly 75 seconds. 1 minute left. I looked across the expansive lounge. David was still trapped inside the soundproof glass booth. He sat with his back to the seating area, nodding emphatically, pointing his finger, and selling his manufactured corporate crisis to a deadline. He looked so powerful in his tailored suit. He had no idea that his entire future had just been relocated into the luggage of the woman he was sleeping with. Then, a sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the hum of the lounge. Click. 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 The unmistakable sound of designer heels striking the polished marble of the hallway leading from the restrooms. The footsteps were fast, sharp, and very determined. My internal clock screamed, 45 seconds. The footsteps grew louder, echoing off the frosted glass partitions. Someone was walking straight toward our secluded corner. I crossed my legs, adjusted the collar of my blouse, and raised the edge of my glass to my lips. I regulated my breathing, forcing my chest to rise and fall in a slow, relaxed rhythm. I stared blankly at the digital departure board mounted on the opposite wall. The absolute picture of a bored, waiting wife. The footsteps rounded the corner. Chloe walked into our area. Her lipstick had been flawlessly reapplied in a bright, aggressive shade of red. Not a single hair on her head was out of place. She carried herself with the arrogant strut of a woman who believed she had already won the war. She looked down at her Louis Vuitton suitcase, sitting on the carpet. It looked completely untouched. She had absolutely no idea her pristine luggage was now a ticking time bomb waiting to obliterate her life. Chloe dropped heavily into the chair across from me. She crossed her legs and picked up her phone, completely ignoring my presence. She let out a soft, theatrical sigh of irritation, tapping her meticulously manicured nails against the screen. "David certainly isn't rushing, is he?" she muttered, her eyes glued to her device. "You'd think the board could survive without him for a few hours. He works way too hard." I lowered my glass, letting the cool crystal rest against my knee. The irony of her statement was practically suffocating. I looked straight into her perfectly contoured face. I thought about the heavy, black package resting mere inches beneath her designer shoes. I thought about the armed CBP officers waiting on the other side of the security checkpoint. I gave her a sweet, blood-curdling smile. "He's incredibly dedicated to his work," I replied in a smooth, painstakingly polite voice. "But don't worry, Chloe. I have a strange feeling David is about to take a very long, very permanent vacation from all his corporate responsibilities. He just has to get through security first." Chloe finally looked up from her phone. She met my gaze, and her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. She sensed something strange in my tone, something razor-sharp that she couldn't quite identify. But her arrogance quickly drowned out her instincts. She smirked condescendingly, returning her attention to the screen. "I certainly hope so, Claire," she said dismissively. "I think we're all ready for a change of scenery." I took another sip of my drink, letting the citrus and champagne burn the back of my throat. I looked at the Louis Vuitton bag on the floor, then raised my eyes to the soundproof booth. David was just hanging up, turning around with a triumphant, satisfied smile. He stepped out of the booth and began walking toward us, entirely unaware that he was marching straight to the slaughterhouse. The 3-minute window closed. The trap snapped shut securely. It was time for the walk to the guillotine. David approached our seating area with long, quick strides. He slid his phone into the pocket of his tailored suit and clapped his hands together. The sound echoed sharply in our quiet corner. "Crisis averted," he announced, his voice far too loud and strained with artificial relief. He looked at me, then cast a quick glance at my black suitcase, leaning against the frosted glass partition. His gaze lingered on the zipper for a fraction of a second too long. "Ready to go, honey?" I stood up smoothly, smoothing the creases in my trousers. "Completely ready." Chloe rose from her chair, grabbing the handle of her Louis Vuitton bag, the bag that now carried a federal prison sentence hidden deep in its lining. She adjusted her designer trench coat and shot David a brief, knowing smile. "Let's go," she said. "I have a very long flight ahead of me." David reached for my black suitcase, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the handle tightly. He lifted it with a sudden, jerky motion, overcompensating for the weight he expected to feel. A look of confusion flashed across his face as the suitcase lifted much easier than it should have. It weighed 3 pounds less because the brick of drugs was no longer there, but his brain hadn't processed the physical discrepancy yet. He adjusted his grip, chalking it up to the adrenaline pulsing through his veins. I picked up my leather tote bag, slung it over my shoulder, and stepped out into the main aisle. We left the VIP lounge and blended into the hum of the international terminal. The walk to the priority security checkpoint was a mere 200 yards, but the psychological distance felt like a marathon. I watched David closely as we walked. His facade of the relaxed husband was rapidly disintegrating. A thick layer of sweat appeared on the back of his neck, glistening under the bright terminal lights. He was walking far too fast, eating up the distance on the polished concrete floor with his long legs, forcing Chloe and me to pick up the pace just to keep up. He kept looking over his shoulder, checking to make sure I was right behind him. He wanted to be certain his trophy was safely in his line of sight. Chloe walked lightly on my left. The polyurethane wheels of her Louis Vuitton suitcase hummed a steady, rhythmic melody as they struck the floor. Every rotation of those wheels brought $8 million stolen from corporate accounts and 3 pounds of synthetic narcotics closer to federal law enforcement. She complained about the dry airport air, completely oblivious to the fact that she was currently the highest value target in the entire building. The contrast between my husband's frantic energy and my absolute, ice-cold calm was striking. I matched his urgent pace step for step, but my breathing remained perfectly regulated. I was like a spectator, watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion. David was rushing toward his own execution, dragging his mistress along as collateral damage. He thought he was making the final move in a chess game he had rigged from the start. He had no idea the board had just been flipped. The priority security checkpoint loomed ahead. The area was cordoned off by thick velvet ropes and staffed by stern-faced TSA officers. Behind their stations, massive gray X-ray scanners swallowed luggage on heavy black conveyor belts. David practically shoved his boarding pass and ID into the hands of the agent working the podium. He bounced on his toes from nervous energy, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his cheeks twitched. I handed over my documents with a polite, casual smile, offering a pleasant greeting. The agent nodded, checked my passport and ticket, and waved us through. We entered the screening zone. The air smelled of ozone, floor wax, and the nervous sweat of rushing travelers. The ambient noise created a chaotic symphony of clattering plastic bins, sharp commands from security personnel, and the low mechanical hum of the active scanners. David bypassed an empty lane and aggressively steered us toward a specific conveyor belt on the far right. He wanted a lane with a clear, unobstructed view of the monitor. He wanted front row seats to the spectacle of my destruction. He grabbed 3 gray plastic bins from the stack and slammed them onto the metal rollers. He turned to me. His eyes were wide, his pupils dilated with manic anticipation. "Go ahead, Claire," he urged, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed excitement. "You go first. Put your things on the belt. Let's get this over with quickly so we can go relax." He physically stepped aside, blocking Chloe's path forward and ensuring I would be the one standing directly in front of the machine. He positioned himself perfectly to see the agent's face the moment my black suitcase entered the scanner. I stepped up to the stainless steel rollers. This moment had finally arrived. The culmination of months of terrifying psychological abuse, obsessive financial tracking, and meticulous midnight planning. It all came down to the next 60 seconds. I didn't hesitate. I moved with uncanny fluidity. I took off my coat and laid it neatly in the first gray bin. I placed my heavy leather tote into the second bin, making sure to pull my laptop out and place it in a separate tray, per security protocols. Then, I reached for the handle of my black suitcase. David stood right behind me. He was breathing shallowly and irregularly. He was practically vibrating with a toxic cocktail of fear and impending victory. I hoisted the black suitcase and placed it squarely on the conveyor belt. The heavy fabric settled onto the rubber rollers with a dull thud. I glanced at David. His gaze was locked onto the luggage with terrifying, almost hungry intensity. He was waiting for the sirens to sound. He was waiting for the heavy hands of law enforcement to throw me to the cold floor. I looked away and returned my attention to the line. I stood completely still, letting my arms hang loosely at my sides. The beating of my heart felt like a massive, steady drum inside my chest. I watched the thick, black rubber curtains of the X-ray machine part, swallowing my suitcase into the dark scanning tunnel. I didn't look away. I waited for the machine to do its job, armed with the absolute, terrifying certainty that nothing would appear on the screen except silk dresses and linen pants. The thick black rubber curtains of the X-ray machine engulfed my suitcase. My eyes were fixed on the glowing monitor hanging just above the TSA officer's station. The screen displayed a dynamically shifting landscape in bright colors, revealing the stark interior of the luggage illuminated by penetrating radiation. Bright blue denoted the metal zippers and hardware. Dense oranges and greens mapped the organic material of my folded silk dresses and pants. David stood so close to the conveyor belt that the fabric of his tailored jacket practically brushed against the stainless steel edge. He leaned forward, craning his neck at an unnatural angle, just to get a clear view of the monitor. He was waiting for the moment a massive, unnaturally dense orange block would appear on the screen. He was waiting for the emergence of that unmistakable, rectangular void that would signal a hidden package stuffed with synthetic narcotics. He held his breath. His entire body was like a spring coiled to its absolute limit. He was so tense I could literally see the adrenaline pumping in his jugular vein. Meanwhile, the TSA officer stared at the screen with total blankness. He held a half-empty water bottle, his eyes glazed with the heavy fatigue of a man who had already seen thousands of identical bags that morning. The conveyor belt hummed its quiet, mechanical tune. The illuminated X-ray of my suitcase scrolled smoothly across the entire monitor. There was no rectangular form. There was no trace of a dense, alarming mass of organic material hidden deep in the lining. There was absolutely nothing that deviated from the norm. The officer blinked sleepily, took a sip of water, and looked away from the monitor. He didn't hit the red emergency stop button. He didn't reach for his radio. He didn't signal the armed officers on the perimeter of the zone. The heavy black curtains at the exit of the machine's tunnel parted, releasing my pristine black suitcase straight into the brightly lit retrieval area. It was completely untouched. I turned my back to the conveyor belt and confidently stepped toward the advanced millimeter wave scanner. I handed my boarding pass to the agent guarding the entrance. I nodded politely and stepped into the cylindrical enclosure. I placed my feet precisely on the yellow-painted footprints, raised my arms above my head, and clasped my hands as instructed. The mechanical arm of the scanner, whirred to life, swiftly rotating around my body. I closed my eyes for a moment, secretly savoring the incredible sensation of crystalline freedom that filled me right then. I carried nothing but my ID and my boarding pass. Legally and physically, I was clean. I was untouchable. "Step out, please," the agent instructed, pointing toward the exit. I stepped out of the scanner. The small monitor attached to the machine displayed a solid, reassuring green screen: no anomaly detection, no secondary pat-down procedures required. I was completely free. I walked calmly to the stainless steel retrieval zone where my plastic bins and suitcase waited. I slipped my shoes back onto my feet. I pulled my laptop from the plastic tray and effortlessly slid it into my heavy leather tote bag. Then, I wrapped my fingers around the telescopic handle of my black suitcase and pulled it off the rollers. I looked across the security checkpoint at my husband. David hadn't moved an inch. He was rooted to the spot, staring at the empty space on the conveyor belt where my suitcase had rested just moments before. His hands gripped the edge of the metal table so tightly, his knuckles had gone completely white. The color had entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He looked like a man who had just watched the laws of physics reverse before his very eyes. His reality was actively shattering into a million jagged pieces. He looked at the bored TSA officer, then back at the empty conveyor belt, until finally, his panicked gaze shifted across the checkpoint and met mine. I gave him a gentle, encouraging little wave. David opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His chest began to heave in rapid, shallow spasms. He was hyperventilating. The meticulous, arrogant corporate VP was short-circuiting right in the middle of the priority security line. His brain was desperately trying to process an impossible equation. He knew exactly what he had done at 2:00 a.m. He vividly remembered the blade of the knife slicing the nylon fabric of my luggage. He remembered the heavy, dense weight of the black tape-wrapped package. He remembered burying it, hiding it, sealing my fate with his own 2 hands. And yet, the suitcase had passed through federal security without raising a single alarm. I could see the frantic, terrified calculations racing behind his wide eyes. Did the X-ray machine malfunction? That was statistically impossible. Did the officer simply miss it? A package of that size would be glaringly obvious even to a blind man. Had he somehow forgotten to pack it? No. That memory was burned into his mind. He felt the package. He zipped the zipper. The only remaining logical conclusion was so horrifying, so destructive to his sense of control, that his mind simply refused to accept it. The package was gone. David took a stumbling half-step backward, bumping hard into the person standing directly behind him. He didn't even turn around to apologize. A bead of cold sweat broke from his hairline, trailing slowly, agonizingly down the side of his pale face. His tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. With a trembling hand, he reached up to loosen his silk tie, desperately trying to force oxygen into his tightened lungs. "Step forward, sir," the TSA agent barked impatiently, pointing to the empty space in front of David. "You're holding up the line. Put your items in the bin and step through the metal detector." David jumped at the sharp command, his shoulders twitching violently. He looked completely lost. He blindly patted his pockets, pulling out his wallet, keys, and expensive phone, dropping them all into the gray plastic bin with clumsy, uncoordinated movements. His hands were shaking so badly that several coins spilled over the edge, hitting the stainless steel table with a loud clatter. "Sir," the agent repeated, her voice dripping with annoyance. "Your bags. Put them on the belt." Right behind him, Chloe let out a loud, exaggerated sigh of impatience. "David, for God's sake," she muttered, shoving her pristine Louis Vuitton suitcase forward until it hit his calves with a dull thud. "What is taking you so long? You're holding us both up. Just push the bins forward so I can get my stuff scanned." David didn't answer her. He couldn't force a single word out. He was entirely consumed by the blinding panic of a predator who suddenly realized he was standing in the middle of an empty trap. He shoved his briefcase and duffel bag onto the conveyor belt with jerky, mechanical motions. Stumbling, he walked blindly toward the metal detector, his eyes glazed over, his mind spinning completely out of control. I waited patiently at the end of the retrieval zone, gripping the handle of my perfectly clean suitcase. I watched Chloe lift her heavy designer luggage onto the metal rollers. I watched her push it toward the dark, gaping maw of the X-ray tunnel. David stumbled through the metal detector, his gaze locked onto my face, frantically searching for an answer, a clue, any shadow of comprehension. I merely tilted my head slightly, sending him that same sweet, oblivious smile. The game was no longer his. The execution had arrived. Chloe breezed through the advanced scanner with the amplified sigh of a woman who had been egregiously subjected to the indignities of standard citizen procedures. She patted her perfectly styled hair, retrieved her expensive trench coat from the gray bin, and draped it over her shoulders with theatrical flair. She didn't look at David. And she certainly didn't look at me. All her attention was focused on the exit. She just wanted to escape this tedious checkpoint and head straight to her luxury international flight. Her pristine Louis Vuitton rolling suitcase was next in line. It glided smoothly over the stainless steel rollers, bumped slightly against the rubber curtain, and was swallowed by the dark tunnel of the X-ray scanner. I didn't take my eyes off the TSA officer operating the monitor. Just seconds earlier, this same man had been the embodiment of bureaucratic apathy, sipping water and staring blankly at an endless parade of neck pillows and toiletry bags. The moment Chloe's designer luggage slid across his screen, his entire posture drastically changed. He stopped chewing his gum, his spine snapped straight, pressing hard against the back of his ergonomic chair. He leaned forward so intensely that his nose nearly touched the glass of the monitor. His hand flew across the control panel, punching in a rapid sequence of commands to sharpen the image, adjusting the contrast and density settings. Whatever he saw was massive, anomalous, and terrifyingly dense. He didn't hesitate for a single second. His hand shot out and slammed down hard on the large red button mounted on the side of the console. The steady, humming drone of the conveyor belt instantly died. The stainless steel rollers locked up with a violent, mechanical screech that echoed sharply across the terminal. And then, the alarms started blaring. This wasn't a quiet, discreet warning chime. It was a deafening, piercing siren that sliced through the airport noise like a physical weapon. Strobe lights mounted on the ceiling directly above our security lane began flashing in rapid, blinding intervals. The routine boredom of the checkpoint completely evaporated, instantly replaced by the tense, electrified atmosphere of a severe security threat. Chloe jumped, startled by the sudden noise. She looked up at the flashing lights, her perfectly contoured face twisting into a mask of pure indignation. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, aggressively tapping her designer shoe against the airport floor. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Chloe huffed, her voice cutting through the roar of the alarm. She shot a murderous glare at the officer behind the monitor. "Excuse me. Turn that noise off. My flight leaves in an hour. And you are holding up my luggage. I have premium passenger status. This is completely unacceptable." She truly believed this was just some minor bureaucratic glitch. She thought a bottle of expensive perfume had spilled or her curling iron had triggered a false alarm. Her arrogance was so deeply ingrained that the idea of genuine, inescapable danger hadn't even crossed her mind. She tapped the screen of her phone, pulling up her airline app, ready to flash her boarding pass and demand to speak to a shift supervisor. David, however, was experiencing an entirely different reality. He stood just 3 feet away from her, and he was literally falling to pieces. When the conveyor belt stopped, paralysis gripped his entire body. He looked at the X-ray monitor, then at the dark opening of the machine where Chloe's luggage was trapped, until finally, his gaze shifted to me. The mathematical equation in his head finally snapped together. The impossible variables suddenly aligned. The 3-pound brick of synthetic narcotics and the encrypted drive containing $8 million in stolen funds hadn't vanished into thin air. They had just changed addresses. I maintained my delicate, unwavering smile, bearing his gaze with absolute, blood-curdling calm. David looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. His complexion went from ashen gray to a sickly, translucent white. He reached up with trembling fingers, desperately tearing at the knot of his silk tie. He yanked it down violently, ripping the top button of his expensive dress shirt in the process. He needed oxygen, but his lungs were completely blocked. He staggered backward, his knees buckling slightly. His polished leather shoes slipped against the smooth floor. "David, do something," Chloe snapped, turning to him. "Tell them who you are. Tell them we're flying first class, and they need to release my bag right now." David couldn't utter a word. His mouth opened and closed in rapid, soundless spasms, resembling a fish pulled from the ocean and thrown onto a burning dock. He clutched his chest, right over his heart. His breathing grew shallow into wheezing, rattling gasps. He knew exactly what was inside that bag, and he knew exactly whose name was attached to it. The life sentence he had so meticulously prepared for his wife was now sitting squarely in his mistress's lap. And because they were traveling together, because he had paid for her ticket with his corporate credit card, the blast radius of this explosion was going to incinerate him right alongside her. "Clear the lane. Clear the immediate area." A commanding shout rang out from the far end of the checkpoint. The standard TSA agents rapidly fell back, forming a wide perimeter. Heavy, synchronized footsteps pounded against the concrete floor, moving with terrifying speed. A specialized CBP tactical unit stormed toward the scanner. They were clad in dark, heavy tactical gear, their faces grim and focused. But it wasn't just the armed officers that made the crowd of waiting passengers gasp and step back. It was the K-9 unit. The same German Shepherd that had flagged Chloe's bag in the priority line had returned. And this time, the animal was absolutely feral. The handler could barely hold onto the heavy leather leash as the dog surged forward, its claws scrambling against the smooth floor, desperately trying to find traction. The dog dragged the officer straight to the stalled conveyor belt. This time, it didn't just sit. It lunged at the machine, barking with a furious, deafening intensity, its front paws frantically scratching at the rubber curtains, trying to get to the Louis Vuitton suitcase trapped inside. Chloe finally stopped tapping her phone. Her indignant posture completely collapsed as the powerful, aggressive animal furiously barked at her belongings. She took a terrified step back, her eyes wide with genuine alarm. "What is happening?" she stammered, her high-pitched voice cracking. "Why is that dog doing that? Get it away from my things. Do not move from that spot." A tactical officer barked, pointing a stern finger directly at her chest. David was now having a full-blown panic attack. His legs finally gave out. He crashed hard into a stack of empty gray plastic bins, sending them clattering loudly across the screening zone. He slid down the wall, hitting the floor hard. He pulled his knees to his chest, wrapped his arms around his head, and rocked back and forth. The sophisticated, arrogant corporate VP had been reduced to a hyperventilating, terrified child. He was watching his entire universe burn to ash, and he knew there was absolutely no escape. I stood quietly at the edge of the retrieval zone. My posture was relaxed. My hands rested elegantly on the handle of my perfectly clean suitcase. I watched the tactical team surround Chloe's bag. I watched the dog continue its frantic positive alert. I watched my husband gasping for air on the cold airport floor. The execution was proceeding exactly according to plan, and the explosion was only just beginning. The tactical team secured the perimeter with breathtaking efficiency. Passengers in adjacent lanes were shoved back, their complaints instantly silenced by the hard stares of heavily armed officers. The air in the terminal grew thick, charged with the heavy, electric tension of an active law enforcement operation. The German Shepherd was finally pulled back, its handler wrestling to control the animal's aggressive lunges toward Chloe's bag. Then, the crowd parted. A tall, imposing figure marched through the security zone. He wore the navy blue uniform of a CBP task force captain. The gold insignia on his shoulders gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His presence commanded absolute, immediate silence. It was a silence born of respect, authority, and undeniable power. It was Jamal, my younger sister Rachel's husband. My brother-in-law, a man who had built his career on an unwavering, ironclad foundation of integrity. He didn't play politics. He didn't bend rules. He was the kind of officer who would arrest his own mother if she tried to bypass a customs declaration. He walked directly to the stalled conveyor belt. His dark eyes scanned the scene, registering hyperventilating David on the floor, terrified Chloe being pressed against the metal table, and finally, me. Our eyes met. Jamal didn't smile. He didn't offer a reassuring wave or a familial greeting. His expression remained entirely stoic. It was a mask of pure, professional authority. But in that microscopic fraction of a second our eyes locked, I saw it. A subtle, barely perceptible nod. It was a silent acknowledgement. An unspoken agreement that the chessboard was set, the pawns were in place, and the endgame had officially begun. He broke eye contact and shifted his heavy, piercing gaze to Chloe. She flinched, pressing her back flat against the stainless steel inspection table, her expensive trench coat slipping off her shoulders. "Captain," the TSA supervisor said, his voice trembling slightly. "We have a positive alert from the K9 unit on this luggage. The passenger claims ownership." Jamal stepped up to the Louis Vuitton suitcase. He didn't ask for permission. He grabbed the gold zippers and yanked the main compartment open. He didn't even bother sifting through the designer clothes. His large hands went straight to the base of the luggage, feeling for the unnatural rigidity along the spine of the suitcase. He found the internal zipper, the exact same one I had closed just 10 minutes prior. He pulled the zipper open. The heavy, black tape-wrapped package sat right there, nestled between the structural ribs of the suitcase. Jamal reached inside and pulled the 3-pound brick of synthetic narcotics straight out into the bright terminal light. He held it up, inspecting the meticulous packaging. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a hunter who had just cornered his prey. "Who does this luggage belong to?" Jamal demanded, his deep, resonant baritone echoing through the quiet checkpoint. Chloe's jaw trembled. She looked at the black package, then at Jamal, her eyes wide with pure terror. She raised a shaking finger and aimed it directly at David, who was still cowering on the floor, struggling to breathe. "He's my boss," Chloe stammered, her voice breaking. "He bought my ticket. He told me to carry that bag. I don't know what that is." "He packed it." Jamal turned slowly, looking down at David. The corporate VP was now a pathetic, broken wreck of a man. His expensive suit was crumpled. His tie hung loosely around his neck, and his face shined with cold sweat. He looked up at Jamal, his eyes darting frantically between the imposing officer and the black package of drugs. "Sir," Jamal said, his tone devoid of any emotion. "Is this your luggage?" David tried to stand, but his legs refused to cooperate. He slumped back against the plastic bins, his hands desperately clutching his own chest. His mind was actively disintegrating. The arrogant, calculating embezzler had completely vanished, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal. He looked at Chloe, then at the package, until finally, his panicked gaze shifted to me. I stood there, the very embodiment of calm, unflinching innocence. I gave him a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of my head. It was the physical incarnation of his own favorite phrase. "You're losing touch with reality." David stared at me, and his eyes widened in sudden, horrifying comprehension. He saw the trap. He saw the cold, calculated precision of my revenge. He realized that his brilliant, foolproof plan to send his own wife to a foreign prison had just been reversed with lethal accuracy. The absolute terror of his situation completely broke his mind. The rational corporate facade evaporated, leaving only blind, primal panic. "No!" David shrieked, his voice raw and hysterical. "No, it's not like that." Scrambling onto his knees, he pointed a trembling finger at the black package in Jamal's hand. He lost all sense of self-preservation. Panic drowned out his survival instincts. He just wanted the nightmare to end, and in his desperation, he made the most catastrophic mistake of his life. "That's impossible," David wailed, his face twisting in absolute terror. "That was supposed to be in my wife's suitcase." The entire checkpoint froze. The silence that followed those words was absolute, heavy, and profound. The TSA supervisor stared at him in disbelief. Chloe covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with shock. The waiting passengers in adjacent lanes gasped loudly. David had just confessed. He had just admitted in front of a dozen officers and countless witnesses that he intended to plant 3 pounds of synthetic narcotics in his wife's luggage. He had just handed them the entire case on a silver platter. Jamal didn't even blink. His expression remained incredibly stoic, but I could see a quiet, dangerous satisfaction burning in his dark eyes. He slowly lowered the black package, setting it on the metal table. He reached up and tapped the small body camera mounted on the center of his chest. "Thank you for the confession, sir," Jamal said, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying rumble. He gestured to the tactical officers, standing behind him. "Hands behind your backs. You are both under arrest for international drug trafficking." 2 armed officers surged forward. They grabbed David by the arms, hauling him to his feet with brutal, unyielding force. They slammed him against the stainless steel table, wrenching his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of handcuffs echoing across the terminal was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Chloe started screaming. A high-pitched, hysterical wail. As another officer grabbed her arms, she fought the cuffs, kicking and thrashing, begging them to let her go. David didn't fight. He went completely limp. His eyes were glazed, his spirit utterly broken. He stared at me as they dragged him away, his face a mask of absolute, unadulterated horror. I stood quietly in the retrieval zone, my hands elegantly folded over the handle of my clean suitcase. I watched them drag my husband and his mistress away in handcuffs. The explosion was complete, and the execution had been flawless. The reality of a drug bust isn't a cinematic event filled with dramatic music and heroic slow-motion acts. It happens with brutal, suffocating speed. Jamal stood like a statue carved from obsidian. The heavy, tape-wrapped package rested securely in his broad hand. The gold captain's insignia on his collar reflected the harsh fluorescent lights of the terminal. He kept his eyes locked on Chloe. The young executive assistant was pressing herself so hard against the stainless steel inspection table that her knuckles had turned completely white. Chloe looked at the vacuum-sealed brick of drugs, then down at her pristine designer bag. The mathematical equation finally clicked together in her head. She was standing in the middle of an international airport with a commercial quantity of synthetic narcotics hidden in her personal belongings. She opened her mouth, and a sound completely devoid of human dignity ripped from her throat. It was a shrill, vibrating shriek of pure, unadulterated terror. I had never seen anything like it. Chloe was sobbing uncontrollably. Her manicured hands shook violently as she aimed a trembling finger straight at David. "He's my boss!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "He bought my ticket. He insisted on loading the bags into the car this morning. He put that in there. I'm just a secretary. He's trying to frame me. Please, you have to believe me. I have no idea what that is." Jamal didn't even flinch. He offered her not an ounce of sympathy. He shifted his heavy, piercing gaze down to the floor, where David was currently suffocating in a panic of his own making. David lay curled at the base of the X-ray machine. His expensive, tailored suit was now covered in gray dust from the airport floor. He clutched his chest, pulling in air in rapid, shallow gasps that weren't filling his lungs at all. He looked up at Jamal, then at the hysterical Chloe, until his bloodshot eyes finally locked onto me. I stood exactly where I had been. My posture was perfectly straight. My hands rested lightly on the telescopic handle of my clean suitcase. I didn't throw him a lifeline. I didn't scream or cry. I offered him the exact same devastating silence he had used against me for the past year. David's mind simply couldn't process the failure of his own brilliant genius. He was a powerful VP. He believed he was the smartest man in the boardroom. He had planned the perfect corporate embezzlement and the perfect marital execution. The cognitive dissonance of suddenly seeing the executioner's blade rushing straight toward his own neck completely shattered his psyche. The rational, calculating executive died on that linoleum floor, leaving behind only a terrified, cornered animal. Desperation drowned out every survival instinct he had. He scrambled forward onto all fours, completely ignoring the CBP tactical officers who immediately placed their hands on their holstered weapons at his sudden, erratic movement. He pointed a trembling, sweaty finger at the black brick resting in Jamal's hand. "That's impossible!" David shrieked. His voice cracked into a pathetic, high-pitched wail that echoed off the high ceilings of the terminal. "That shouldn't be there. That was supposed to be in my wife's suitcase." The entire checkpoint plunged into a silence so deep it felt like a vacuum. The hum of passenger conversations, the clatter of plastic bins, the announcements from the terminal speakers, it all instantly evaporated. Every single person in the vicinity turned to stare at the man on the floor. Chloe stopped crying. Her jaw dropped as she stared at the man she was sleeping with. In that one horrifying second, it dawned on her that he had never planned to protect her. He had planned to use her as bait in case his operation went south. The affair, the luxury hotel stays, the expensive jewelry, it was all just a down payment for her role as collateral damage. Jamal slowly lowered the package onto the metal inspection table. His face was a mask of cold, unyielding law enforcement authority. He reached up with a steady hand and tapped the small square body camera mounted on the center of his tactical vest. The small red light blinked steadily, confirming it was actively recording every single word spoken in that lane. "Thank you for the confession, sir," Jamal said. His deep voice resonated with absolute, terrifying finality. "Hands behind your backs." That command broke the spell. The tactical officers descended on David like wolves. They grabbed him by the arms, hauling him off the floor with zero respect for his expensive tailored suit. They slammed him chest first onto the stainless steel inspection table, right next to the package of drugs. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs clamping securely around his wrists was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. Two female CBP officers stepped forward, securing Chloe's hands behind her back. She didn't fight them. She just stood there, openly sobbing, her mascara running in dark, jagged streams down her pale cheeks. The pristine, designer luggage she had been so incredibly proud of was now being tagged and bagged as physical evidence in a federal investigation. Jamal stood directly in front of David. He leaned in slightly, ensuring his voice was perfectly captured by the microphone on his vest. "You have the right to remain silent," Jamal began, reciting the Miranda warning with chilling precision. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." David was hyperventilating, his cheek pressed hard against the cold metal table. He craned his neck, straining against the iron grip of the tactical officers, frantically searching the crowd of uniforms with his eyes. "Claire," he begged, tears mixing with the thick drops of sweat rolling down his face. "Claire, tell them I'm innocent. I'm begging you, you have to help me. Tell them this is a mistake." I took a slow, deliberate step forward. I stopped just outside the perimeter set by the tactical team. I looked down at the man who had spent months trying to convince me I was losing my mind. At the man who stole $8 million and planned to let me rot in a foreign prison while he drank champagne on a tropical island. I leaned in slightly, dropping my voice to a sharp whisper that only he could hear. "You're just imagining things, David," I said softly, locking eyes with his terrified stare. "You're losing touch with reality." The color completely drained from his face. His eyes rolled back slightly as the absolute nightmare of his reality finally crushed his spirit. Jamal signaled the officers. They hoisted David up and began marching him through the terminal. The crowd of delayed passengers parted like the Red Sea. Hundreds of people held up their smartphones, recording the wealthy, arrogant executive being dragged away in absolute disgrace. Chloe walked behind him, her head bowed in deep shame. The flashing red and blue strobe lights from the checkpoint illuminated the concourse, casting long, chaotic shadows against the walls. The sound of their shuffling footsteps faded into the distance, drowned out by the urgent whispers of the surrounding crowd uploading their videos to social media. A profound sense of lightness settled over my shoulders. The heavy, suffocating anxiety I had carried inside me for months evaporated into the sterile airport air. My husband had built a cage designed to hold me forever, but ultimately, he was the one who walked into it and handed me the key. I picked up my leather tote bag, adjusted my coat, and prepared for the final phase of his destruction. The stark, windowless interrogation room, hidden deep in the bowels of JFK Airport, was a masterpiece of psychological pressure. Fluorescent lights buzzed relentlessly overhead, casting long, harsh shadows across the scratched metal table bolted to the floor. The air was freezing, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Inside this concrete box, the grand romance between the arrogant VP and his ambitious assistant had completely disintegrated. The illusion of their grand, glamorous future had shattered against the brutal reality of international drug trafficking charges. Her expensive designer trench coat lay crumpled on a plastic chair. She paced the small room like a caged animal, her voice shrill and desperate as she aimed a shaking finger at David. "He framed me. He told me to pack that bag. I didn't know what was in it. He's trying to ruin my life." David sat slouched in a metal chair. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his tie hung loosely around his neck. The confident, calculating executive was gone. In his place remained a pathetic, terrified man desperately trying to save his own skin. "She's lying. She's a mule. I didn't know anything about any drugs. She's trying to pin this all on me." The mutual accusations flew back and forth, a pathetic, disgusting display of survival instinct. The partnership built on stolen money and deception dissolved into mutual betrayal the second the stakes became real. They were at each other's throats, tearing each other apart, completely oblivious to the fact that they were both already doomed. Jamal stood silently by the heavy steel door, arms crossed over his chest. His face, an impenetrable mask of federal authority. He watched the spectacle with the cold detachment of an experienced officer accustomed to seeing the worst of human nature. He didn't intervene. He just let them dig their graves deeper with every panicked accusation. Then, the heavy metal door clicked open. The arguing stopped instantly. Both David and Chloe snapped their heads toward the sound, their eyes wide with the desperate, pathetic hope that their lawyer had arrived. Instead, I walked in. I wasn't wearing handcuffs. I wasn't being escorted by CBP tactical officers. I walked in accompanied by my high-powered corporate attorney, a woman named Evelyn, whose reputation as a ruthless destroyer of corrupt executives preceded her. My posture was perfectly straight, and my expression was an impenetrable mask of calm, cold determination. David's jaw dropped. The desperate hope in his eyes vanished, replaced by a deep, sickening realization. He saw me standing there free, untouchable, and shielded by ruthless legal representation. He finally understood that the trap hadn't just snapped shut on Chloe. It had snapped shut on both of them, and I was the one holding the detonator. "Claire," David whispered. His voice trembled, barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer him. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, and I didn't hurl accusations. I simply walked over to the metal table, pulled out the chair across from him, and sat down. Evelyn stood silently behind me, an intimidating presence radiating absolute legal authority. I placed a thick, pristine, color-coded audit binder onto the scratched metal surface. The sound it made was quiet, yet it echoed in the small room with the absolute finality of a court's verdict being read. David stared at the audit binder. The pristine, color-coded tabs seemed to mock the absolute chaos of his current reality. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers hovering over the thick cardboard cover as if he were terrified to touch it. He looked up at me, his wide, bloodshot eyes searching for any sign of mercy. He found none. I didn't yell. There was no need to. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the cold metal table, and delivered his execution sentence with chilling, measured precision. "You really thought I was just imagining it all, didn't you, David?" I said, my voice scarcely louder than a whisper, yet it echoed loudly off the concrete walls. "You spent months trying to convince me I was crazy. You isolated me from the world. You made me question my own memory. You thought you broke me and turned me into an obedient, paranoid shell." I paused, letting the silence stretch out, letting the weight of my words press him into his chair. "But you made one fatal mistake," I continued. "You forgot who you married. You forgot that I make my living dismantling financial lies." I reached out and slowly opened the binder. The first page displayed a massive, complex flowchart. It tracked the origin of the $8 million, detailing the fake supply chain invoices, the Delaware shell companies, and the offshore wire transfers. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, a meticulously documented roadmap of his corporate treason. David's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the flowchart, his eyes tracing the red lines connecting his supposedly hidden accounts. The blood entirely drained from his face. He looked like he was going to physically pass out. "I found your flash drive, David," I said, my voice dropping to a level of terrifying, absolute calm. "The one you tried to bury under 3 pounds of synthetic narcotics in my suitcase. The same one that was supposed to guarantee me a life sentence in a Maldivian prison." Chloe gasped loudly in the corner of the room, her hands flying to her mouth. She didn't know about the embezzlement. She didn't know the true scale of the monster she had been sleeping with. "I cracked your military encryption in 7 minutes, I stated, leaning comfortably back in my chair. "I copied every single byte of data. The recovery phrases to your crypto wallets, the fabricated emails designed to frame me, and, of course, the master ledger of your little $8 million corporate heist." David let out a choked, desperate sound. He gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning white. "Claire, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "We can fix this. We can work this out. I'll give you everything. The house, the accounts, whatever you want. Just don't give them that drive." I gave him a small, cold smile. "You're losing touch with reality, David," I said, throwing his favorite, manipulated phrase right back in his face. I glanced at my watch. It is exactly 10:45 a.m. This morning, promptly at 6:00 a.m. While you were busy packing my suitcase into the SUV, I initiated a secure automated data transfer. I paused, making absolutely sure he heard and understood every single word. I sent the complete, unredacted contents of your flash drive directly to the New York field office of the FBI. A copy went to the Enforcement Division of the SEC. And just to be safe, I sent this entire dossier to the personal email address of your CEO. David's eyes rolled back slightly. He slumped forward, his forehead hitting the metal table with a dull thud. A quiet, agonizing groan tore from his lips. You aren't just going away for international drug trafficking, David, I concluded, standing up and smoothing the creases in my trousers. You are going down for massive, multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. Your company is already freezing your assets. The FBI is more than likely raiding your office right now. Have fun spending the next 20 years in federal lockup. I turned away from the table and walked toward the heavy steel door. I didn't look back at Chloe, who was now sobbing openly, realizing her life had been completely and irrevocably destroyed. I didn't look back at David, who was weeping against the cold metal, now just a broken, pathetic shell of the arrogant man he once was. Jamal opened the door for me. His expression remained perfectly stoic, but I caught that subtle, respectful nod as I walked past him. I stepped out of the interrogation room into the bright, bustling airport corridor. The air felt incredibly light. The heavy, suffocating anxiety I had carried inside me for months had evaporated for good. The execution was complete. The monster was locked in a cage. I walked toward the exit with my head held high, ready to step into a future that finally belonged entirely to me. The overarching narrative running through these profound experiences highlights one of the most painful, yet ultimately liberating, lessons a person can learn. Your internal sense of self-worth is never dictated by those who refuse to see it, even if those people are your own family. For years, the subjects of these stories sought acceptance from parents and siblings who continually offered them nothing but conditional love, exclusion, and manipulation. Whether it was revoking an invitation to a beloved family trip, abandonment during profound grief, or ridicule for following an independent path, the heartbreak always had its roots in the desperate hope that blood ties would ultimately guarantee basic respect. However, the true turning point in each of these stories occurs when that hope is finally abandoned. The lesson here is that drawing hard boundaries and walking away from a toxic environment is not an act of cruelty or revenge. It is an absolutely necessary act of self-preservation. When you stop fighting to be appreciated by people who fundamentally desire to misunderstand you, you reclaim your own power. You realize that you cannot control how others treat you, but you have absolute control over what you are willing to accept. By severing ties with the cycle of emotional abuse and conditional acceptance, we open the door to building our own chosen family. We learn that true love is defined by those who stand by us in our darkest moments and celebrate our victories without any ulterior motives. True success does not lie in forcing toxic people to show you respect. It lies in building a life so authentically fulfilling that their opinions simply cease to matter. If you are currently exhausting yourself trying to earn the love of people who constantly tear you down, take a step back today and decide to invest that energy into building your own boundaries.